The wind in that territory felt like it had fangs, and its voice was nothing but spite. Roaring down from the Bitterroot Mountains, it signaled a winter that would serve as a funeral shroud for Providence Gulch's inhabitants. This foe was well known, something you combated with sturdy walls, blazing hearths, and camaraderie born from shared struggle. Yet for Elias Thorn, it remained a relentless, mocking presence. From their solid log homes they observed him, their lit windows resembling warm, critical gazes. They gazed upon his toil on the wreckage of the Henderson barn, its backbone broken in a summer tempest. The barn's rafters lay exposed to the harsh, leaden heavens. He refused to patch the massive holes in the roof or swap out the splintered beams of the exterior walls. Rather, he toiled inside those skeletal ruins, a man constructing a tomb for himself and the frail, pallid girl who meant everything to him. The ridicule began as a faint murmur at the general store, a collective snicker over cups of watery coffee. "Thorn has lost his mind," they declared, as if stating an undeniable truth. "Erecting a dwelling inside a wreck? That's akin to placing a fresh egg in a spoiled container." The mockery became more audacious, born on the same gusts he struggled against. Daily riders would pass his property, reining in their mounts to yell jeers that the wind would snatch and toss like withered foliage. "That barn wouldn't withstand a good sneeze, Elias," a man shouted, his tone dripping with scorn. "The harsh season will strip your skeleton bare." He never raised his eyes, nor did he offer them the gratification of a reply. His universe had contracted to the steady rasp of his spade, the creak of timber, and the crisp impact of rock against rock. From the entrance of their rundown claim shanty, his daughter Alera observed, hugging a woolen blanket to her chin. Her cough formed a delicate contrast to the howling gale. He wasn't constructing a foolish project. He was shaping a refuge, and the ridicule, the contempt, the unwavering conviction that he would fail, that was merely additional wind. In many years past, he had mastered the art of pushing against the gale. The recollection that propelled him was keener than any icy cold. That memory was of his wife Lena, whose breath became a soft murmur against the coarse fabric of a wagon shelter. The frost claimed her life. In the previous settlement, the doctor had delivered a blunt, harsh fact. "This child," he had continued, pointing at the small, gasping bundle that was Alera, "possesses equally delicate lungs. A severe winter will take her as well." That statement had become the very foundation of Elias Thorn's life. That truth was both the flame within his gut and the chill in his blood. He had acquired the failed Henderson homestead for next to nothing, not for the barren soil, but for the wreck that occupied it. To the townspeople, it was just rubble. To Elias, it was a husk, a barrier. He was aware that he didn't have enough time, supplies, or energy to erect a proper log house. Prior to the thick, initial snows locking themselves onto the landscape, he possessed nothing but his bare hands, an obstinate determination, and a concept hatched from necessity and keen watching. A notion the rest were too traditional and too complacent to even imagine. He collaborated with the very soil. He excavated inside the barn's outline, embedding the base of his actual dwelling 4 feet downward, beneath the freeze depth. He transported rocks from the river individually using a shaky sled, his body aching in agony. He then arranged them to construct a short, sturdy partition. He devoted weeks to slicing turf from the meadow. Massive blocks of turf and earth were placed upon the stone, their loamy scent hinting at warmth retention. The townsfolk observed a man excavating what seemed to be his own burial plot, piling soil as if insane, yet they failed to grasp the method behind it. The concept of the ground's insulation, or the heat retained in the subsoil, eluded them. They misinterpreted the barn. Rather than being his dwelling, it served as a phantom, a diversion. The structure's skeletal framework was designed to absorb the wind's initial furious attack, to blunt its force. It would scatter the concentrated fury into countless weaker drafts. The genuine struggle would occur within. Within the tiny, well-sealed chamber he was constructing, a fight for every precious degree of heat took place, a fight for a child's survival. The first severe freeze arrived unannounced, like a nocturnal burglar, as the mercury dropped sharply. At dawn, the world found itself trapped under a fragile crust of ice. In Providence Gulch, stoves consumed timber voraciously, and households drew nearer to one another. Their amusement regarding Elias Thorn died away, supplanted by the harsh truths of their own perseverance. They recalled him now with a certain grim contentment. They pictured him and the girl as frozen corpses in their earth-walled foolishness, a lesson in the cost of arrogance. A handful of men, guided by the town's self-styled leader, a cattleman called Jebediah Fuller, traveled to the Henderson property. This was no rescue operation. Rather, it was a somber journey to verify a foregone conclusion. They discovered the site in silence, the massive, dilapidated barn blanketed in snow, resembling the skeleton of a beast. A slender wisp of smoke, remarkably unwavering, rose from a stone chimney protruding through the debris. They descended from their horses, their boots creating a crunching melody of intrusion, and moved toward the barn's gaping entrance. The wind, a relentless torment during their journey, seemed curiously subdued here due to the barn's broken walls. Despite being riddled with gaps, these walls functioned like a huge strainer, transforming the wind's unified power into a chaotic, harmless breeze, and they gazed inward. Their vision acclimated to the dimness. Then they noticed it, situated at the heart of the extensive wreckage, a squat, dirt-covered shelter, no larger than a trapper's shack. It seemed to be an integral component of the terrain. The turf walls sparkled with a delicate coating of ice. However, it was the ice on the exterior of those sod walls that rendered them wordless inside. Via the lone, tiny window, fashioned from oiled parchment, they observed the gentle, constant glow of a lantern. Jebediah advanced. "Thorn!" he shouted, his tone jarringly loud amid the quiet. "Are you and the child still living in there?" The thick wooden door creaked open a bit. Elijah stood within, his visage weary, yet his gaze sharp, as he regarded them a mute gathering of condemners. He responded simply, "We are," with a monotone delivery, and did nothing to welcome them inside. He merely remained standing, like a barrier. Jebediah grunted. "Your flame is still burning." It was clearly no inquiry. That was a recrimination. A gust of humid, heated air, scented with burnt timber and boiled grains, drifted out of the hut and brushed by their frigid, numb cheeks. It seemed almost tangible. This was an inconceivable mystery. They exchanged glances, the contempt in their gazes transforming into a different emotion, one more biting and intricate: bewilderment. The snowstorm came 3 days afterward. It wasn't merely a storm. It was a conflict, a continuous, howling offensive of white that obliterated everything. The blizzard entombed fences, devoured pathways, and merged the heavens and earth into one swirling maelstrom of icy rage. For 48 hours, Providence Gulch remained in suspended dread. The gale howled against their panes and scratched at their entryways. The chill infiltrated the mortar of their sturdy log homes. A relentless, sneaky robber, and fuel stores diminished worryingly. At the Fuller residence, the pail of water by the entrance turned entirely to ice. Inside the general store, a box of potatoes had frozen, solid like stones. The jokes about Elias Thorn now seemed like a far-off memory, a silly noise from another era. His name had become a hushed puzzle, prompting anxious guesses. A brief pause in the blizzard gave a tiny glimpse of the outside. Men pressed their faces against the icy windows, gazing toward his property. All they could see was swirling snow, but the same question lingered in the cold atmosphere of every home. How could his shelter, a crude hut of mud and stone constructed within a ruined barn, survive such a storm? They concluded it must have been destroyed, wiped off the landscape. They talked about the little girl with a dark, delayed sympathy, but only after the wind had worn itself out. When the storm left a landscape reshaped by thick, quiet drifts of snow, the first sight they noticed was the smoke. The smoke ascended from that thorny spot, a constant, unshakable gray column against the dawn's bruised purple sky. It wasn't the frantic, gusting smoke of a fire that needed constant tending to barely hold off the cold. It was steady, economical, and maddeningly, unbelievably ordinary. A young man called Caleb, whose own roof had almost collapsed from the snow's weight, couldn't stand the unknown any longer. He fastened his snowshoes and set off on the difficult journey. As he got nearer, he realized the huge, shattered frame of the barn had functioned like a massive barrier for the snow. This had built a huge snowdrift that wrapped around the northern and western flanks of the inner cabin, covering it and adding more insulation. The wind had been forced into helping with its own failure. Caleb arrived at the barn's opening and peered inside. The inner cabin resembled a mound of dirt and snow, like the burrow of a sleeping animal. The air in the barn was motionless and deeply quiet, and the temperature was noticeably, unmistakably higher than on the open plain. He could sense it on his skin. He noticed a thermometer, an uncommon and valuable device, fastened to the outer side of Elias's door. The mercury was stuck at the lowest point, frozen. Then he spotted another thermometer positioned just inside the exposed barn, shielded from the breeze, and it showed 10 below zero. The contrast was astonishing. That barn the wreck they had all ridiculed acted as a silent protector, a blanket. It boosted the surrounding temperature by a crucial, life-saving amount even before the inner walls started doing their job. The so-called fool on the hill hadn't erected just a single barrier against the cold. He had created two. The image of Elias Thorn walking out after the massive storm turned into a local legend repeated countless times. He didn't look exhausted or frostbitten. He wasn't a survivor dragging himself out of a disaster. He moved with measured, efficient steps, expression stern but physique robust, and started clearing a walkway from his doorway. Shortly afterward, the door swung open once more, and Alera emerged, wrapped in wool and rabbit pelts. She didn't cough. She stood in the weak, pale sunlight, her features still fine and fragile. However, a faint rosy color appeared in her cheeks, something the townspeople had never witnessed. The residents of Providence Gulch observed from afar, their confidence broken, their ridicule revealed as foolishness. The quiet that settled on the town weighed more than the snow itself. It was a silence loaded with bitterness, with a reluctant, sour admiration that felt like cinders on their tongues. They had forecast his destruction and hoped for it in the hidden, mean-spirited depths of their souls. Yet he had shown every one of them to be mistaken. The collective sense of being pragmatic, tough survivors, became uncertain. He had outsmarted them, endured longer than them, and accomplished it single-handedly after being expelled by them. That quiet, reclusive individual now held something they urgently required. A secret, the key to enduring a winter that had tested everyone's endurance. The murmurs resumed, but with a different tone. No longer considered a fool, he was stockpiling information. His behavior seemed selfish, maybe even aberrant. Silas Kane, whose charm was as fragile as fresh ice atop deep waters, spotted a chance. Kane operated the settlement's sole transport business and perceived financial gain in each wheel rotation and each hushed rumor. He traveled to the Thorn property, his horse pushing through thick snow. He got off the horse, not with a merchant's boastful stride, but with the sleek, predatory poise of an associate. "Thorn," he shouted, his tone slick and amiable. "That's quite a feat you've managed here." "Everyone in town is discussing it," Elias halted, his shovel leaning against a pile of snow. He remained silent. "I have a business offer," Kane went on, moving nearer, his grin not touching his eyes. "A person with your expertise and a person with my networks, we could market this concept, construct these dwellings for incoming residents, and become wealthy." He waved his hand toward the clever construction. "What's your answer?" Elias shifted his gaze from Kane's grinning face to the humble cabin where his daughter was secure and cozy. He remembered their contempt. He recalled their mockery, their unwavering belief that he would fail and perish, and the many frigid nights of labor. With his body sore, motivated solely by a vow to a specter and the noise of a child's weak respiration, he faced Silas Kane again. His face gave nothing away, and his reply was one frosty word slicing through the winter atmosphere: no. That refusal impacted Silas Kane, not as a setback, but as a personal affront. He had proposed a collaboration, a route to riches, and was turned down with a single sound. His grin, his main asset in business, disappeared as he journeyed back to Providence Gulch. In its stead emerged a foul and treacherous notion. If he could not possess Thorn's invention, he would control the story surrounding it. He intended to transform the town's underlying bitterness into a blazing inferno, and he would be the one to benefit from it. He began at the tavern, purchasing whiskey for a gathering of men whose harvests had been ruined and whose morale was flagging. "It's a peculiar thing, Thorn's fortune," he started, his tone lowered to a secretive whisper. "The most severe winter in 10 years, Yet he and that frail girl are cozier than insects in a carpet, warmer than we are in our log cabins constructed through hard work. He let those phrases linger in the hazy room. He sowed suspicion and anxiety. He mentioned the eerie depth of the dwelling, excavated into the ground like a tomb. He insinuated that the rocks were arranged in an odd, disturbing design. The ground provides heat, he would declare, gently shaking his head, but it can extract a cost. He preyed on their tiredness, their resentment, and the old slumbering superstitions that tough times often bring to the surface, as well as Jebediah Fuller's pride, still stinging from the day he had gone to see Thorn's ruin, only to discover that his accomplishment turned into Cain's most productive soil. "It's an insult to God," Fuller proclaimed one evening, his voice echoing through the general store. Humanity's purpose is to construct upon the land, not to dig into it like a gopher or a pagan. There is an unnatural quality to such behavior. The story changed direction. Elias ceased to be viewed as the obstinate simpleton or the fortunate oddball. He became the alien, the stranger who had bargained with forbidden wisdom to safeguard his own, abandoning everyone else to the harshness of a just winter. When he went to the shop for scant provisions, the community's overall look, previously scornful, turned stern and distrustful. Discussions halted, an aisle opened up in front of him, and residents drew their kids nearer as though he were infected with disease. In the past, they mocked him. Currently, they dreaded him, and Cain understood with icy assurance that dread is a far more effective instrument than mockery. That fear required a release, a tangible manifestation. It started with a deceased crow deposited on his doorstep, its wings extended in a macabre scene. Using a stick, Elias lifted it and tossed it into the snow. With an impassive expression, he recognized its meaning: a caution, a crude symbol designed to frighten and threaten. Yet he was not someone who was easily frightened. His anxieties were concrete matters: a nighttime cough, the decreasing stock of logs, and the steady fall of mercury in a thermometer. The irrational beliefs of bitter individuals were merely another type of climate, and he had constructed his existence around withstanding such climate. The subsequent hostile action was more overt. One morning he woke to an eerie quiet. The usual creaking of the barn's beams in the breeze had ceased. Upon exiting his inner quarters into the expansive covered area, he perceived the reason. Overnight, an unknown person had arrived and severed the primary ropes and supports. These had been maintaining the broken southern barn wall in a condition of unstable balance. That whole part had caved in, forming a jumbled pile of fragmented wood and corroded nails, partly obstructing the main door. This was an inept act of vandalism, intended not to ruin his dwelling but to confine him, cause trouble, and menace. Its purpose was to demonstrate that they could get to him. The whole day he devoted to removing the debris. This labor was exhausting and hazardous. His fingers, already split and hardened with calluses, became lacerated and bloody. Once he had finished handling each beam, he shifted. His anger solidified into a firmer, more lasting state: determination. However, they believed the barn served as his protection. They failed to grasp that the barn was merely an emblem, a diversion. His actual stronghold consisted of turf, rock, and determination. That night, he didn't merely clear the way. He reconstructed and hauled the biggest of the collapsed beams, then jammed them against the existing walls to strengthen them. He employed the debris to construct a tight, protectable passage. He was repurposing their own tactic against them. Fortifying his defenses, he labored well into dusk, his breath forming clouds in the icy atmosphere. The steady strike of his hatchet sent a signal to the attentive hills. This communication declared that he would neither depart nor yield. He was entrenching. 7 days afterward, they arrived for him, on a day so frigid that the very air appeared to snap. Silas Cain headed the group, but he was astute enough to allow Jebediah Fuller to speak on behalf of all, with their faces covered in wool fabric. Their gazes were rigid, with a contrived sense of moral superiority. Their horses were ridden into the barn's ruined shell, an obvious intimidation tactic, as their presence filled the area with the warmth of animals and the chill of men. Elias stood outside splitting a log when they showed up. He continued with his task. Lifting the axe, he swung it down in a sharp, strong motion. The log split cleanly into 2 equal pieces. He turned to face them only at that point, the axe held casually in one hand by his side. "This has dragged on too far," Thornfuller shouted, his voice reverberating from the barn's leftover walls. "We want to find out how you manage it. There's no natural explanation for a mud hut staying so warm in this freezing weather. We demand the secret," and Elias gazed at every one of them. His stare paused briefly on Cain, who held back a little, wearing a self-satisfied expression that suggested he had planned this. Elias's eyes were dull, empty of either fear or friendliness. "There isn't any secret," he replied, his tone quiet and steady. "There is only the labor." Cain let out a brief, unpleasant laugh. "Don't act like a fool with us. You have some kind of trick, some native sorcery or other thing you're keeping to yourself. The townsfolk are frightened. They believe you've put a curse on this place." The charge lingered in the atmosphere, ridiculous yet dangerous, coming from within the cabin. The parchment window shone with lamplight, and a tiny shadow briefly emerged. The sight of Alera watching her sharpened Elias's cold rage into a single precise point. He stepped forward. The axe still hung at his side. "The sole curse around here is jealousy," he said, his voice sinking even deeper but bearing a fresh undertone of threat. "You all stood on your porches and chuckled. You anticipated that winter would finish us off, but you didn't succeed. Now you show up making threats because your arrogance is even colder than your homes. Leave my property." Fuller's hand moved toward the gun on his belt. "That's a request we're not likely to grant. We've come for explanations," and Elias lifted the axe, not in a menacing motion, but placing its heavy blade onto his shoulder. "I've already provided my response. The next answer will be inscribed in blood and bone. Go now." The men exchanged glances, then stared at the unyielding fierceness. In Elias's gaze, they found no deception, no terror. They saw someone who had already encountered death in more silent, freezing ways, and was not intimidated by this noisy, bombastic manifestation. Their intent had been to scare a timid recluse. Instead, they discovered a monarch in his fortress, prepared to perish to protect his one valuable asset. The last attack arrived beneath the concealment of a fresh blizzard. The wind picked up once more, a wailing ally to their wickedness, its roar masking the noise of their footsteps. This time there were 6 men, made bold by liquor and Cain's poisonous mutterings. They didn't arrive riding openly. They walked, bearing lanterns, cords, and sturdy crowbars. Their purpose was crystal clear. Their plan was to literally demolish the barn surrounding his cabin, ripping apart its exterior structure. They intended to allow the entire lethal power of the snowstorm to carry out the job they lacked the nerve to perform on their own. Elias, however, was awake. He had been anticipating, scanning the heavens. He had paid attention to the breeze and sensed the collective animosity of the town accumulating like an approaching tempest. As soon as a silhouette shifted across the snow-dusted debris, he was prepared, having already put out the light in his dwelling. Inside the barn, a bewildering labyrinth of dark silhouettes and dim moonlight bouncing off the snow enveloped everything. This was his territory. The dilapidated structure they had ridiculed had transformed into a battleground of his own design. The initial intruder, a muscular laborer called O'Malley, stumbled over a line Elias had stretched tightly across 2 broken beams. He collapsed noisily onto a heap of scattered planks, breaking his lantern and casting their section of the building into gloom. Chaos and terror broke out. "He's present and ready for us." A cry rang out, and Elias drifted like a specter through the yet to the sit arranged. The debris served as his camouflage, turning him into a quiet hunter stalking through well-known terrain. The axe was not employed for killing. Instead, as an instrument of fear, he slammed the blunt side of the blade onto a wooden pillar close to Fuller's cranium. The strike resonated like a firearm discharge, raining chips of wood and frost onto the frightened victim. Meanwhile, another fellow attempting to grip an elevated beam discovered his hands sliding across a frozen spot Elias had intentionally produced by pouring water from a pail earlier that night. He descended, his spine striking the icy earth with force, breath leaving his lungs. Pandemonium reigned. They were contending not only with a person, but with the very building, the barn. His sizable maline shield had become his offensive tool. Their goal had been to demolish his dwelling, yet they ended up disoriented and bruised within a crumbling maze stalked by a quiet, avenging phantom. The conflict concluded anticlimactically, more a fizzle than an explosion. Jebediah Fuller, with his courage shattered, ultimately discharged his revolver randomly into the void. The projectile bounced off an iced metal piece and ripped a jagged hole in the ceiling, achieving zero results. Nevertheless, that shot appeared to shatter the enchantment of their intoxicated fury, superseded by a sobering awareness of their predicament. These were weapon-carrying individuals, defeated by one weaponless person amidst debris, now hurling accusations at one another. They hauled their injured and beaten comrades from the wreckage and escaped into the blizzard. Having won, Elias chose not to go after them. He remained in the quiet gloom of the barn, hearing until the noise of their departure was consumed by the gusts. His breath came in ragged gasps, his frame sore, yet a deep tranquility enveloped him. He had confronted their ultimate test. After enduring the harshest reality, he pivoted and strode back to his modest, mud-built dwelling, went inside, and bolted the robust entrance. The heat inside struck like a tangible explosion, a soft hug, and Alera, awake, sat upright on her bed with wide eyes. He knelt next to her and murmured, "Everything is fine," in a hoarse tone. She remarked, "The tempest has passed," while observing the wounds on his face and the fatigue in his stance. For the first occasion, she appeared not as a delicate reliant, but as a tiny, fierce reflection of his own fortitude. "I wasn't afraid, Papa," she declared, her tone firm and clear. "We were inside our home. We're secure inside our home." He merely nodded, the pressure in his chest lifting following that evening. Never again did any inhabitant of Providence Gulch trouble him. The tale of their disgrace, murmured from husband to spouse to local, turned into a far stronger deterrent than any partition made of timber or rock. Silas Kane departed the settlement 1 month afterward, his standing ruined. The community's contempt for Elias Thorn soured and vanished, substituted by a profound, quiet, and extremely reluctant admiration. His methods were always a mystery to them. They never truly understood how he accomplished what he did. As time passed, the man himself turned into a legend. He was known as the Winter King, the man of the earth. Travelers were instructed to find the peculiar ruin atop the hill, where a slender, continuous column of smoke would always ascend. Regardless of how bitterly the wind blew, that smoke came from a dwelling constructed not from timber or boards, but from determination and resourcefulness. This was a home designed to quiet the wind, bring shame to the town, and contain the stillness. It was the steady pulse of a life that, against all odds, refused to be snuffed out.